So I'm essentially proposing that marriage is a war.
Now, if I believe that marriage is all about me and my happiness, then when I'm not happy, I walk. And I've heard this so many times. I'm leaving. Why are you leaving? Because I'm just not happy anymore. Well, get unhappy. Well, I just don't believe that God would want me unhappy. 2 purposes for marriage in the scriptures. Your happiness is not one of them. Suck it up and go work it out. If I look at it selfishly, that's what happens. When I'm not happy anymore, when I'm not satisfied anymore, when I'm not fulfilled anymore, I'm ready to walk. But if I understand that our marriage is an illustration, a picture of the relationship between Christ and his church, then I understand that I am here for the long haul. I tell my wife all the time, girl, you leave me, I'm going with you.
The most foundational thing that can be said about marriage on the basis of this text, indeed, the most foundational thing that can be said on the basis of the whole Bible about marriage, is that it is God's doing. And the most ultimate thing that we can say from the Bible about marriage is that it is for God's glory. Those 2 things are the 2 points of the message. Staying married is not about staying in love. It's about covenant keeping.
We have been lied to. We have been sold a bill of goods as it relates to love. And this is a problem because we've bought into the Greco-Roman myth of romantic love. And so when we say love, a lot of times, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about this Greco-Roman myth that has at the center Cupid. And Cupid, this little cherub, shoots you with his arrow. And when he shoots you with his arrow, there is this overwhelming passion that comes upon you. And you begin to say strange things like, this thing is bigger than both of us.
Mark 10 is the words of Jesus, verses 8 and 9. Jesus quotes Genesis 2:24. For Jesus, this verse was the most fundamental verse about marriage in all of the Bible. This is Jesus' foundation stone for the beginning of all of his teachings about marriage. Verse 8, Mark 10. The 2 shall become one flesh. So, Jesus says, they are no longer 2, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. That's huge. Do you feel the weight of that? Engaged couples, married couples. When a couple speaks their vows and consummates their vows with sexual union, it is not man, woman, pastor, parent who's the main actor. God is. God joins a husband and a wife in one flesh. God does that. God does that. From which Jesus draws the awesome conclusion, what God has joined, no man may separate.
But this is what we believe about love. And this is part of our problem. That even in church, we believe this about love. That, that there's some overwhelming force will strike you. And when this overwhelming force strikes you, there's nothing you can do about it. You have to be drawn along by this overwhelming force and do what it tells you to do. And we use phrases like, follow your heart. You know what the Bible says about the heart? It's wicked and not to be trusted. Here's problem number one that we have with the Greco-Roman myth of romantic love. If that's what love is, if it's just this overwhelming force, and if the heart just wants what it wants, and if it's uncontrollable, and if we don't choose who we fall in love with, you know, and if this thing is bigger than both of us, if that's true, then no marriage is safe. If that's true.
I just hope that this seed will land in a 6-year-old heart, 9, 11, 16, 22, 33, 44, 61, 80-year-old heart with a new, deep sense. It's about covenant keeping.
That's why we had to create another idea to go along with it. The idea of the one.
I just hope that fiber will be made a little stronger in our children, a little stronger in teenagers, a little stronger in wives and husbands, that we are not blown around by the billboards, the internet, the movies, the television. We've got roots in reality, in Genesis, in creation. We don't blow. We stand. All hell breaks loose against this marriage. We stand. That's what little by we become that kind of people. There are many wimps in the world, men and women. I'm in the business of putting fiber into the backbone of wimps.
That is ridiculous. It's absolutely ludicrous, not to mention the fact that it's grossly unbiblical. That has no biblical merit whatsoever. If we buy into the Greco-Roman myth of romantic love, we are hopeless, and we will never ever feel secure enough to get married to anybody. Here's the other problem with this idea of the one. You can never know it objectively.
But stand in the face of their desires. Stand in the face of their passions and say, you are not my God. God is my God. Covenant is my life.
And so all of a sudden, a year into your marriage, things get difficult because living with another person is difficult.
God will never leave his wife. There were some separations in the Old Testament. I can handle that in the church. Get that bad. He never divorced her. He wooed her back every time.
And so when we look here in Ephesians chapter 5, and we see first and foremost that the husband's responsibility in the marriage is to lead in love, the first thing we have to do is we have to define this love. And it's not the Greco-Roman myth of romantic love, it's biblical love. Several things I want to say about it. First of all, look at this verse. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. Number one, Christ is our model for love. Jesus does not love the church because she's fine. Jesus does not love the church because she makes him happy. Jesus loves the church because he loves the church. Because she's his bride. He has covenant with her. He chooses to love the church. It's not an overwhelming emotion that has to somehow be sustained over the years. It's not an overwhelming force that struck him one day that made him decide that he was going to sacrifice his life on behalf of his bride, the church. Jesus is our model. His sacrificial love for the church. Here's the definition. Biblical love is an act of the will accompanied by emotion that leads to action on behalf of its object. Let me give it to you again. Biblical love is an act of the will. It is first and foremost a choice. We do choose. It is an act of the will. It is accompanied by emotion, which means it's not void of emotion, but it's also not led by emotion. And it leads to action on behalf of its object. Now, I told you Jesus was our model for this kind of love. Think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prays, if there is any other way, let this bitter cup pass from me. It's the night before his crucifixion, and he prays to be delivered from this bitter cup of God's wrath. He doesn't feel like going to the cross the next day. And then he says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. It was an act of the will. He chose to love the church. It was accompanied by emotion, so intense that he sweat drops of blood, and it led to action on behalf of its object. Jesus didn't need the cross. You and I did. He didn't do that because it made him feel good about himself. He did that because it was the only way for his bride to be redeemed. That is biblical love. That is not the whimsical Greco-Roman myth of romantic love. That is something that lasts. It is something that is stable. It is something that stays. It is something that will serve as a foundation upon which a marriage can be built. The Greco-Roman myth is not so. You cannot build a solid marriage on the Greco-Roman myth. It doesn't work. That's why you got people walking away from each other just saying, well, we just fell out of love. What? You fell out of love? What? You fell out of love? What is that? The kind of love that the husband is supposed to lead in is a love that begins with the will. It's interesting. When Moses says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, you know, your heart's a muscle that pumps blood. That's all it is. Your heart doesn't know anything. It doesn't want anything. It doesn't yearn for anything. It's a muscle that pumps blood. That's all it is. When we see that word heart in the Bible, it's usually being used in figurative terms. And in the Hebrew, it refers to your volition, to your will. And so we love as an act of our will. It is a choice. You know why? Because there are going to be difficult days in your marriage. And the will is what gets you through difficult days. Like a dear friend of mine, Dan Yeary. He's a pastor of a church in Phoenix. His wife has multiple sclerosis. I was with them a few months ago. And she is so advanced in this disease now that she's in a wheelchair and she can't walk and she can't get around, and they're both advancing in age. And I spent the day with them. And everywhere they went, he would grab her arms and he'd wrap them around his neck, and he'd grab her around the waist, and he'd struggle and he'd pick her up, get her in her chair, get the chair to the car. He'd do the same thing again, struggle to get her in the car, get the chair in the car, get to where they're going, same thing again, over and over and over. He bathes her. He feeds her. He takes her to the bathroom. You don't get that with the Greco-Roman myth of romantic love. Cupid doesn't give you that. That is the will. That is a man who says, I choose to love you with everything that I have for the rest of our life together. I choose to love you. That is what you're looking for. They don't look like they used to when they first got married. So if they built their marriage on that, it would be gone. She can't even get around like she used to. If they built their marriage on that, it would be gone. Do you not think he gets tired? Biblical love leads with the will.
Well, with tears in their eyes, they should pursue them and plead with them not to shatter the image of Christ in his church. The reason God says not to divorce and calls it adultery when you divorce and marry another person is because he ordained that Christ's relationship to the church be clearly portrayed in the marriages of his people, indeed in marriage in general. Christ never divorces his church, ever, under any circumstances. And he calls us to be that faithful. And so I would plead with my friend, don't do it. And then I would come alongside them and say, what is it? And help them, whether it's financially or with counseling or rebuke or whatever it is that is making the marriage look unworkable. Try to say, we'll help you, we'll work with you in this. Sometimes you can rescue it. And we've lost people recently at Bethlehem and had to put one man out of the church because he resisted every form of counsel and love and exhortation and pleading that he would not walk away from his wife. I'm discouraged about this somewhat because there are a lot of believers today who are finding scholarly warrants for making divorce easier. And frankly, I think in our culture we need to make it harder, not easier. And so that's sad to me.
What God has joined, no man may separate.